How you doing today? Awesome. My name is Danielle Savoy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the director of the Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and I have to take a small moment because I met Taté online through her writings a couple years ago when I was doing research on mascots, and she has just been a part of my brain and activism and feminism ever since. So earlier this year, the previous director and I were trying to figure out what we could do for Native American Heritage Month. And I said, oh, we could get Taté. So we reached out to them and we were trying to figure out how are we gonna get them here? And then here comes Lynn Barton and she says, we need someone. And I said, I have the perfect person, and she's here, and I'm so, so happy to introduce her. Taté Walker is a Lakota citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe of South Dakota who writes, and writes. They are a banner-waving, two-spirit feminist, Indigenous rights activist, and a published and award-winning storyteller for outlets like Everyday Feminism, Feminist Humanist Alliance, Native Peoples Magazine, and Indian Country Today. Taté uses their 15 years of experience working for daily newspapers, social justice organizations, and tribal education systems to organize students and professionals around issues of critical cultural competency, anti-racism, anti-bias, and inclusive community building. Their new book, Thunder Thighs Trickster Vibes, comes out in 2021, and I just want to plug their book is on sale today, so get it and enjoy. Thank you so much.
Wopila tanka, homitanki api, chante washte iuha na pech yujapi, jisha tatewi imachi api, wakpa washte imantahan. So I just cursed you guys in Lakota. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't. Like she said, no, I didn't. Just kidding. That was my introduction. In lots of traditional societies, it's important to put perspective on place. So I gave you where I'm from, which is South Dakota, way over there. I currently live in Phoenix. I've been there for about 5 years, and I work for the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. Blessed to work with their school system as a communications director. And I like to write. And there's a quote out there that writing, rioting, and writing, as in writing, when you are doing your job appropriately, which is, job can be anything from how you interact with other humans to the career you have. If you're doing those three things, you're probably doing it right. So I try to live by that if I can. So I'm going to be presenting on Trickster Medicine, which follows with my book that's coming out, Thunder Thighs and Trickster Vibes, which was a victim of COVID, sadly, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but I'll be reading my introduction for you, so hopefully you can get a feel for what that's about. But yeah, happy Native American Heritage Month, or as CNN likes to call us, happy something else Heritage Month. This was our, the polls that came through talking about voting for different racial demographic breakdowns. Native Americans got something else, or Indigenous people in general, right? And that sort of happens across the media spectrum, this erasure, right? This contemporary ongoing erasure of Native people and voices. When you talk about states like where I live in Arizona, flipping to blue, huge piece of that is the Native vote. we worked our butts off to get folks registered and out to the polls. And especially when you talk about how COVID-19 has hit our communities, it's fantastic and sort of unbelievable the kind of results that we were able to get. So I'm pretty happy with that. But also happy Native American Heritage Week for you folks here. A whole week. We'll talk about that later. All right, so as with a lot of presentations, being thoughtful in where we are, again with place, is crucial. So my land acknowledgement today is to honor the Paiute, Ute, Goshutes, Shoshone, and Dene, the folks of the past, but also of contemporary nows, right, who continue to care for and live on this land. My action plan for my land acknowledgement today, though, is to help you as an institution create your own land acknowledgement that has actual deliverables, right, and can hold and is something that your student body, especially your Indigenous students, as well as hopefully if there are Indigenous faculty, can hold the institution accountable to. So that's going to be a big part of this presentation that I hope you'll join me in creating. And just some humor for you. Indian country is nothing if not able to turn dire situations like erasure in media into something super funny. So if you've seen any of our t-shirts recently, there's the strong, resilient, Indigenous, but we've now transferred that to strong, resilient, and something else. Ricardo Cate is a well-known cartoonist for the Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper. He also has lots of stuff out. Funny stuff. So his says, hey, you want to play cowboys and something else? Native kids like, huh? And then, something else and proud. So it's good to have humor. And especially when you talk about the modern oppressions that we face, if we can look at it with some positivity, but also doses of reality, right? Because this is important, right? When you don't see the Indigenous people, you're not seeing our issues either. We talk about that in my essay for Fierce, which again is being sold at a bookstore near you, but also in my upcoming book as well. Representation matters. So some housekeeping stuff. This presentation will look at tricksters, the historical but also contemporary uses of trickster stories in particular. They have a lot to teach us. And we, with the medicine that they can offer us, right? And medicine is anything that creates well-being. It's not just, pills that you can take, but it's like the emotions that you take into yourself as well. So those stories have a lot of healing that can happen from them. And tricksters have a lot to teach us with the mess-ups that they create for themselves. And if you're like me, then you've messed up a lot. So I tend to identify with the trickster methods, I think a little bit more than most. But I also want to say that this isn't a 101 lecture on Indigenous people. I can give those, but speaking of someone who is Indigenous, those can get kind of boring because I'm just kind of regurgitating the same things over and over that are easily accessible with whatever search engine you want to use. So when I say things like an umbrella term for my folks is Indigenous or Native American or Native American Indian if you're talking legal terms, or even Indian, which is only an in-community term to use. It's not for non-natives to use. I'm not going to explain that too much. You're just going to have to flow with me there. If you have questions later, I have my contact information. You're welcome to reach out. But I use those interchangeably to, again, refer to the umbrella Indigenous we, if you will. But when I'm speaking specifically on issues that are important to me, I'm usually speaking with specifics to my people. So Lakota or the Ochedi Shakowee, which is sort of the broader societal structure of what is colonially known as the Great Sioux Nation. So, FYI there. Also, always super important when anyone of really any marginalized community talks is to remember that I am not speaking on behalf of the whole, right? None of our cultures are monolithic, and that's even more prescient with Indigenous people because we tend to get lumped into a something else model as a whole, and that's not true. We're looking at actually a lot of results across Indian country, which is the United States version of it. Indian country refers to the folks specifically of the United States. When we talk about like Indigenous people, usually that's a Turtle Island whole concept. So when we look at just like votes, right, we can see a whole lot of variations in how even just Native people voted. So even that's not monolithic, and nothing is. So just as a reminder, there are 574 federally recognized tribes as of this year, and that changes every year. And there are hundreds more tribes not federally recognized. Each of those tribes, of course, has their own language and government and culture, religion, and ways of doing things as a community. And that's really important because what I talk about could be totally different from the other Native friend you might have who says something totally different. It's important to take all that with context. And let's see. And what I'm presenting you today comes from the elders who claim me, the community and lands that claim me, and I'm here to work for them. All right, so Tricksters. You've probably heard of them. You guys are the Thunderbirds for Thor. Thor's brother, of course, is a very well-known trickster, Loki. Indigenous people utilize tricksters in much the same way, but primarily as lesson givers. They were the ones that royally effed up, and we were supposed to take something from that. I think you would be, the common tricksters that you might see are presented here. So in Dene culture, Coyote or Ma'i is a well-known figure. Raven, the Pacific Northwest Coast folks use Raven quite a bit. Lakota, we actually have a trickster, a white Raven trickster, who's done some nasty stuff. And also, the pictograph that you see is Ojibwe, that's Nanabuju, or Gichiwabus, which is a big rabbit. But for Lakota folks, we are, our trickster is Iktomi. So when I speak about tricksters, I'm specifically mentioning Iktomi. And Iktomi in Lakota is spider. And as I mentioned before, my book fell prey to the biggest trickster, I think, of all time, which is COVID-19. And if you think about what tricksters do, and you think about the various successes and failures across the globe related to things like social distancing and mask wearing and hand washing, quite literally the easiest things we can do to be, respectful of each other as humans, leaders' negligible pandemic responses meant that COVID as a trickster flourished, right? We weren't challenging it. And I think we have something to learn with that. Tricksters present you with a problem, and you're supposed to choose the path that overcomes it. And in some stories, tricksters are forced to take their own medicine. Regardless, in whatever cases these tricksters are presented, their magnificent mess-ups are also ways that we learn to endure beyond those. So try to, again, take it with some positivity. So as I study some of these tricksters, Iktomi in particular, I find myself identifying with them, or wanting to identify with them, because in the broad scheme of things, tricksters destroy those false binaries. They blow away the smoke and they crack the mirrors. They troll the status quo and dance out of reach of rules and expectations. There are just as many things to like about them as there are to despise. And for all the mishigas, or the silliness and tomfoolery they present, they also engender great perspicacity or shrewdness and insight. I think that's a pretty cool place to be. So for Ochedi Shakoi, again, that's Iktomi, and as sort of a history of Iktomi, he actually started out in our stories and histories as Ksha, that's K-S-A. Ksha was actually wisdom. It was a spirit being of wisdom. And if you know anything about being wise, a lot of questions are presented by wise people, right? Why is something done this way? Why do we have to do something this way? And again, going back to COVID, I think if we've learned anything, it's that a lot of the rules and expectations we've set up for ourselves as a society are pretty arbitrary. Just taking higher education as a for example, things like SATs and ACTs and even just class attendance, something we can totally, be flexible with. And so that's, again, something positive we can take away from that is that if somebody tells you, no, it's always done this way, maybe push a little bit on that. So Ksha, because he questions the spirit beings a little too much, right? Questioning authority can often backfire. He's relegated or demoted, if you will, to Iktomi, a status of trickster, someone who will always reap and also sow chaos. I think the spirit beings, when you read their stories, perhaps thought that was, again, a demotion, but Iktomi flourished in that role. And when you look at some of the stories, and a lot of our well-known stories are Jit Kalashka, which is, she was one of our first published authors. She's Lakota. She was adopted by a white family and was able to go to Western schooling and learn to take the tales she was told as a young child and present them in a way that was accessible. So very fable-y kind of trickster tales. So, stuff about like how the bear lost his tail or why ducks have red eyes, kind of like pretty straightforward lessons like, well, you don't want to mess with something and then get burned. But actually, when you hear some of the elders tell stories about Trickster, he does some pretty, like there's one about him trying to sleep with his own daughter, which super backfires on him and totally leads the way for like matriarchal justice. But it's also one of those like cringy things because a lot of folks like to think of natives as these very like spiritual and, very like, ooh, speakers to trees and like, dancing with, with wolves. And, we had some weird stuff going on too. Patriarchy is a system, right? And a system in which, our laws benefit. Well, in matriarchal societies, we still had sort of that toxic masculinity happening. That's just a thing. Sorry, guys, I love you too. But, the people mess up and are mended. And when that happened, though, matriarchal justice meant there were things like banishing from the tribe or a system of justice in which no one ever spoke to that person again. They were ostracized, which is a big piece of our justice, is just saying you can't be part of community anymore. That's pretty big. So things from like the lessons we learn or the medicine that we take from those kinds of trickster stories run the gamut. But again, are very easy to understand what the lesson is. They're never like stories that you have to sort of search for the meaning, right? Like, what is it trying to tell me? Nope, incest is bad. That was that story. So take what you will from there. I'd like to tell you a story because, and this is one that's sort of been incorporated into a contemporary sphere because, as I mentioned in my intro to my new book, Indigenous people in general, but especially Lakota people, we didn't have a written word. And that's purposeful. It's not an uncivilized, savage thing where we were like, oh, we have no idea how to use our hands and things to, put them in. It's purposeful because when things aren't canonized into a text to say, this is how it's done, it allows for a lot of evolutionary thought, right? Something might have been done this way, but what if I told the story in a little different context, right? And so those stories can change and do change from storyteller to story receiver, or even just within like where you're giving the story or how, what season you're in. So just keep that in mind. But it's one of my favorites because it sort of goes to this idea of like messaging and using communication or stories to provide sort of medicinal healing to our communities. So this is Iktomi and the Cowboy. So there's a cowboy, and we're at a powwow. And at a lot of powwows, there are livestock sales. And this cowboy is roaming for his next stallion. And he's going from, stall to stall, and he's looking at his options, and he comes across the most magnificent creature he's ever seen. Just glorious coat, and an awesome mane, and just like the ultimate steed. And he looks at the guy who's selling it. And it's Iktomi. And Iktomi is presenting himself as an old native dude, an elder. And he's just sort of sitting there with his cool trucker hat and his plaid shirt that's been washed far too many times. The cowboy, of course, is not native. And he thinks, I can barter this horse from this guy. Just stand back. So he goes to Iktomi and he says, hello, sir, I would love to buy this horse. And Iktomi says, okay, $100. And if you know anything about horse sales, especially like stallions that you can breed and stuff, this was a good deal. And the cowboy's like in his head, what? This guy has obviously no idea what he's selling or what he's doing. I'm getting a great deal. And he's like, $50. And Iktomi's kind of like, okay. And of course the cowboy's like, wait, he's taking $50? Something's not right here. And the cowboy asks Iktomi, what's wrong with this horse then? Like, why are you giving him up so cheap? And Iktomi looks at the horse, and he looks back at the cowboy, and he says, you don't look too good. And the cowboy's like, this Indian has no idea what he's doing. I'm like in the best space available. Oh, great day. So $50 goes to Iktomi, and Iktomi's jazzed. And the cowboy gets his horse, and he takes him back to his farm, his ranch, whatever, and is putting him in the paddock, and the horse is running around, and it's immediately apparent that something is wrong with his horse. The horse keeps running into the fence and charging into people who are standing right in front of him. And the cowboy's like, what? And he calls in his vet, and the vet says immediately, this horse is blind. Why would you buy this horse? And the cowboy's like, what? That little tricksy guy at the powwow sold him to me. I can't believe it. Didn't even tell me he was blind. And he stomps back to the powwow, and he finds Iktomi, betting in the hand game, which you guys had a little lesson in the other day. Hand games are rocking. And he's like, Iktomi, you sold me a blind horse. And Iktomi, winning his hand games, of course, says, I told you, he don't look too good. So, a lesson in communication, especially cross-cultural communication, comes from that story because, as any of you know, we're in a system set up that benefits and sort of prioritizes Western frameworks of all kinds, and that goes into communication too. And especially when you look at, say, treaties, right? Treaties that were the highest law of the land and still are, that were made with sovereign nations for things like land and resources. And you come to understand that there was a lot of miscommunication happening when you look at how those treaties were made. We never had concepts of land ownership. So you might be thinking like, oh, well, New York was given to the Dutch for, beads, those dumb Indians. And it's like, well, when you don't consider land as something you can sell, like I'm sure the natives there, the Lenape, were like, we're getting a great deal, free beads, right? And it's not okay, right? That's not a great way to have cross-cultural relations because then it comes back to, well, you signed this and your signature's on this treaty document and it's our land now. And when you don't have a concept of ownership of relatives, right? Because for especially Lakota people, but especially lots of indigenous people, right, have an idea, a philosophy that everything is related. And that includes, and almost especially includes, our land. And so, a lot of unhelpful miscommunication when it comes to learning across cultures. So, very important. Thank you, Iktomi, for doing that for us. So, this story also then brings me back to my book, which is forthcoming from Mango Press in 2021. Always have to plug that. Also want to plug my, this design, by the way, was from my Danae friend, Devin Harden. Fantastic designer. But yeah, Thunder Thighs and Trickster Vibes. Storied advice from your fat two-spirit auntie. It's me. I'm pretty jazzed about it. I wrote it as a guidebook, right? My audience is me, pretty much. It's the book I needed as sort of a lost Indigenous young person. Someone who had a lot of passionate potential, but had no idea where to go with it or how to utilize concepts that I didn't even know about, things like Mitake oyasin, which I'll describe for you in my introduction here. I think there's a lot of universal truths that can be applied to even non-Native folks, which, I'm hoping, right, because we want, sales. But I also needed it to be for young Indigenous people because guess what? There's a lot of books for non-Natives, and I needed something to be for, say, my daughter coming up in this world. So I'm going to read my intro from that, and I think it sort of provides understanding of where I'm going with this trickster idea, but also like the medicinal healing that can come from these philosophies in a contemporary context. So, first introduction into Thunder Thighs and Trickster Vibes. I don't remember when I first heard the phrase Mitake oyasin, but like bless you to a sneezer or door holding to the next person are exemplifiers of courtesy. it always existed within my peripheral as something you said to convey Indianness. More specifically, you invoked Mitake oyasin to sound more Ocheri Shakoi, which we talked about as the broader societal structure of the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people. Sorry, ASL. Anyway, but these are folks who had traditional and contemporary ties to so-called South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Minnesota, probably Utah. We would have claimed that too. We're those kinds of people. Mitake oyasin was something you said around family, around food, around ceremony and prayer, pretty much any time the spirit moved you, pun intended, because it was always good to say, especially if you didn't know what to say. Not being raised around my Lakota language meant I was often at a loss for words in Indian situations. See powwows, graduations, funerals, birthdays, giveaways, Native American Heritage Week. So, like many who feel disconnected, I latched onto what was accessible and made the phrase Mitake oyasin, though not the philosophy behind it, part of my performative Indian identity. As with most indigenous languages, an exact translation into English is impossible, but many agree Mitake oyasin expresses one's relationship to all living beings. These two words acknowledge complex connections between the speaker and everything living, including place, time, people, animals, our ancestors, and especially the generations to come. Many would say Mitake oyasin means all my relations, or we are all related, or we are all relatives. It should mean and reflect all those things and more. As I grew older, I heard the phrase used to a greater extent in casual contexts, something akin to amen, an ending, or a space filler. And I used it this way myself to impress college peers. My name is Taté, Mitake oyasin. Grunts in Indian. But I heard it adopted by non-Ocheri Shakoi natives who also were grasping on to identifying with anything they considered pan-indigenous enough to fill the void left by historical traumas of genocide, assimilation, relocation, and boarding schools especially. I also heard it even beyond Indian country, used by non-natives before conference presentations, at poetry readings, and yoga studios. No, not the Indian you're thinking. Like tribal-inspired tattoos and store-bought sage, Mitake oyasin was trending among emerging hipsters. And as I work to incorporate the responsibilities I find inherent within the philosophy of Mitake oyasin, throughout my life, trends like these have crashed into my intentions, like never-ending settler waves doing their best to erode the structures of national and cultural pride that I've tried to build over the last decade or so. What's left once those waves of ignorance recede is a Mitake oyasin diluted of purpose and emptied of the ceremony it was meant to convey. So reversing this semantic satiation is necessary and possible. Through Mitake oyasin, the philosophy, we can incorporate ancestral significance into our daily life, and we can begin to heal all interconnections by pledging to strengthen them. My three-part praxis is simple. You find ceremony and daily activities, you incorporate indigenous wellness techniques, and hold yourself and others accountable to radical love. What does that look like? Well, ceremony often takes shape as a shared smudge with my child, and we reflect on our blessings and ongoing responsibilities. This is something we do daily. Or reconnecting with the earth through gardening, indigenous plants and foods, or picking up trash along our favorite path. Wellness can look like growing and consuming our own food and introducing indigenous ingredients to homemade meals and even hygiene products. And accountability may mean learning to be comfortable approaching both friends and strangers when they use harmful, oppressive language, and also learning from those who approach me when I commit those same transgressions. Truly understanding Mitake oyasin is a journey I don't ever expect to finish, but I think I've developed some teachable steps for others to adopt and remake to fit their own decolonizing work. Reclaiming our relationships to land, language, ourselves, each other. It's messy work. As a recovering perfectionist with high anxiety, I struggle with failure on this journey every day. However, these relationships, I believe, are at the heart of what it means to truly decolonize from toxic settler syndrome and the appropriation and eradication of all things Indigenous. Without functional, healthy relationships, no community exists. And then what's the point? I'm no elder. I haven't earned that title, nor have I experienced enough of life to claim to know all its secrets. And I'd be remiss if, in a book about being accountable to relationships, I didn't take an opportunity to apologize to my elders for communicating over their vast spheres of wisdom. Worth noting here is that my Lakota elders, like many Indigenous knowledge keepers, are like forests of information. Ask a question, and they're as likely to offer as many answers as there are medicines in a wild grove of trees. And each answer is as correct as the next, offering healing to the various ailments hidden within the asker's context. What that means is you might read something here, a Lakota word or story, for instance, that's spelled or even told differently than what you've experienced, and I promise they're both correct. One of the most important things I've learned from my elders is that knowledge isn't supposed to be some stagnant pool of water. It's free and flowing and timeless energy that moves through each person, absorbing the parts of us that can benefit others. A useful story told 400 or 1,000 years ago can be updated for today's audiences. The historical facts are maintained, but how that knowledge is used can and should with the storyteller's or story receiver's needs. Stories are a special kind of relative, which is why elders are critical carriers of Indigenous information. Stories, like elders, must be cared for, honored, and shared widely for the unique medicines they offer. I am only in a position to write a book like this because of the advice of many elders, relatives, and mentors who urged me along when I was immobilized with fear, uncertainty, and devastating anxiety and depression. Restoring our connection to elders and placing those relationships in a position of honor where they belong is an important topic I discuss later in the book. In fact, if this book is about anything, it's an exploration of how I want to transition into a role of elder and the responsibilities therein through the advocacy work and community building that's so important to me now. This book is also, to a larger degree, about the relationships that Mitake, oyasin, encourages us to center. That is, all relationships, everyone, everywhere, everything, every when, every how, every why. I lead each chapter with poetry, because that's the sincerest form of kinship magic I can gift to you. I've written poetry since I was a kid, and it's always flowed from me much more easily than what's expected from Western sentence structures. Today, creating poetry exists as a sacred storytelling for me, and the poems I share with others are invitations to know me at my most purposeful, unedited self. I hope both the poems and strategies in this book help community caregivers realize their loves and labors can be intentionally ceremonial, and to recognize intentionality as something that continually moves us to teach and learn from the beings and relatives surrounding us. Like the 70+% of folks who identify as American Indian on the US Census, I too have lived much of my life in urban settings far from my reservation community. For non-natives, this might not seem like a big deal, but it's an important part of my identity and perspective as a Lakota Ina, mother, and two-spirit. I'm also white adjacent and pass as white. My father's Irish and French button nose and ruddy skin tone show through pretty strongly alongside my mother's mini conjou dark hair, eyes, round middle and flat backside, and long legs. My vibe is pop culture sarcasm, drenched in beads and rocking that queer agitator style. Essentially, I'm an INFJ Libra with a dose of Trickster. With my primary career as a communications professional, I have a running performance of code switching among various native and non-native audiences, which has led to important work, as well as financial independence within the settler colonial capitalist system, and also within tribal communities. I used to concern myself with trying to be more native, whatever that means, but as my journey continues, I'm finding what I have to offer is enough, and I don't have to apologize for the pieces of my Lakota identity that I've been able to reclaim, but more importantly, has claimed me back. I was raised by a white man from Brooklyn, New York, so my instinct is to still fill the silence with all the things, but I'm learning to listen. Listening has shown me the importance of exploring my own self-messaging, as well as the messaging from other beings, and that includes, most especially, my non-human relatives. Balancing all the contradictions I experience is made easier through the teachings and philosophies within Mitake oyasin, and I believe it can help others struggling with their identity and callings. Navigating relationships is difficult for anyone, but even more complicated for Indigenous folks overcoming centuries of historical trauma and ongoing systemic disenfranchisement, marginalization, and oppression. That we're still here is a testament to our innate resilience, but survival is an exhausting state to inhabit. Using anti-bullshit Antilogic, trademarked, this book aims to rehome traditional Indigenous relationships into a framework of now, with a roadmap to radical love through pre-wave and intersectional feminist theories. Moving from survivance to thrivance is achievable when fortified with ancestral knowledge, contemporary community building, and real-world magic of the next 7 generations. This book will discuss how traditional understandings of relationships were lost, what must happen to reclaim relationships today, and how to ceremonially engage relations to build capacity for those to come. That was a lot of words. I'm surprised they let that stick. Just kidding. So, I begin each chapter in this book with a poem that complements the topic. And the topics range from pre-colonial family structures, the politics of food or bodies, gender, education, lands, languages, violence against women, all the things. I give an overview of the topic from an Indigenous historical and contemporary lens, and then I outline strategies for how to be a good relative within those frameworks. So that's sort of my book in a nutshell. So as a for instance, one of the chapters talks about how being a good relative, right, or using trickster methodologies to challenge expectations is still something today, even within something like food, right, the politics of food. If you've been paying any attention, this is something that constantly plays out in Native communities. The Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, Canada, are right now fighting the settlers there for their sovereign fishing rights, which have been upheld for centuries. But for whatever reason, is something that these settlers can burn the Mi'kmaq lobster housing and not face any kind of justice. So this happens quite a bit. This has happened in Northwest Coast for salmon fishing rights. But how food plays into just the politics of relationships, right? We put morality on food, right? Oh man, I ate those fries, I'm bad. It's food, right? Why do we put that on food? And food was used as a huge tool for colonialism, right? Removing buffalo from Lakota food systems meant that we became reliant on commodities that the government was giving to us, right? That was a payment for the treaties, by the way. That wasn't something that they were being generous about. And that led to things like the use of highly processed flours and wheat. What you see here today, folks, that's a commod bod, right? That's commodity cheese, which is great, but also not the healthiest food. And so how we reclaim our food, everything from what we would consider, say, unhealthy, right? But also to traditional foods. So incorporating wild rice is something that my partner, who's Ojibwe from Red Lake, Minnesota, is able to do for us. Or I'm learning how to, with the tribe I work for in Salt River, harvest indigenous plants there. So saguaro fruit is amazing and can make quite a few dishes. So that's just one example of how I take sort of a political issue and reframe that into a relative or being a good relative framework. So when it comes out, please purchase it. All right, so a big piece of this discussion is about being a good relative and building foundations today that enforce this idea of a thriving future, because a lot of Native buzzwords, right, can go back to, say, even something like this: the strong, resilient, right? These words like resistance or we survived, right? Persisted. these are words that evoke overcoming a hardship. They're not bad words, and they definitely have a sort of like, an effect that pushes people to do more, I think, in a lot of ways, very motivating words. But as a Ina, as a mother, as someone who's a caregiver, I need us to sort of shift that thinking to survivance, from survivance to thrivance. This idea that I don't want my worth to be something that's just always fighting for something else, right? Wow, she fought for that, and she marched, and wow, she's got such strong words to use, and wow, she's mean, and whatever, and that's that can be cool, but I need my daughter to be to live in a world where maybe she doesn't have to fight so much, right? Because that's an exhausting place to be, to constantly have to fight for your identity. No, I said mascots are harming my mental wellness, and someone's like, no, it doesn't. I'm telling you it doesn't, but I'm telling you it does, right? I mean, that's bullying, right? When we do something someone says hurts them and we keep doing it. So these are things that I don't want to have my kid keep fighting for. So how do we shift to this thrivance model? So as I mentioned in my original sort of agenda for the day, before I leave, I want to create some ideas or help generate some ideas among you to help this institution become a college experience wherein your Indigenous students feel like they can thrive, right? I don't want them to have to be like, we got 1 week, guys. Let's give them all we got, and then just hope for the best after that. I want it to be a daily praxis, right, for this whole institution to just be jazzed that it has Indigenous students here. Because I don't feel like that's something your Indigenous students think they have right now. I had the opportunity to speak with some of Native students here. And to be fair, most of them said really great things about the institution. They really enjoy coming to the school. They love the small class sizes. The area, the land is fantastic. But there are barriers for them. And a lot of them mentioned that they feel like this school actively erases indigeneity of themselves. Go back to this week that they're celebrating. There was an issue with having one of their sessions that they're presenting on missing and murdered Indigenous people, and instead of getting a room where maybe it would have had more visibility, it was relegated to like a basement room. I mean, they were asking for 1 week, and not even that. They were asking for 1 day, and not even that. They were asking for 1 hour, probably, of your time to showcase an issue that impacts the entirety of Turtle Island, missing and murdered Indigenous people. Was it something that would have just totally derailed this education system to give them a room, for an hour? I don't think so. So this erasure, right, this lack of visibility for Indigenous students creates an atmosphere that leads to things like say even retention or just graduation rates, or even whether or not they want to continue matriculating here. So the impact on students when it comes to erasure is pretty huge. So I want to take a look at this idea of visibility because it can be kind of tough to grasp sometimes. And imagine that this school and its students, the entire student body, has mirrors that they're holding up, and those mirrors represent how much they see themselves in the school. And we're just going to take race as the mirror that we're holding up, because you can take any demographic from gender to religion, nation of origin. Like, there's so many things mirrors can reflect. And in this case, I want to specify race, since that's what we're talking about. So you want them to feel represented at Southern Utah University. I hope that's a nod from everybody. And the more your school reflects those students, the bigger the mirrors that each of those students can hold, which then transfers to the better their outcomes, right? Better retention, better graduation, possibly even folks who come back to work here, hopefully. So it's likely your school, as with the majority of every school, does a fantastic job of representing white students. Those students see themselves in the books they're assigned, the authors that they're reading. Most, if not all, areas of study feature content by and about white people, and that's likely taught by professors who look like those white students and have similar life experiences, which can mean more compassion and understanding of student well-being. So white students likely also see themselves in the issues that are important to them within the school's leadership profile as well. So these white students have massive mirrors and are probably surrounded by mirrors because they're just in all facets of their educational experience. They can envision themselves succeeding because they have empirical proof others like them have also succeeded. Rhetorical question, how big do you think the mirrors are for Indigenous students? I have a little one here. I don't know if you can see that. I mean, I can't even get my whole eyeball reflected in that. So I know that was a little bit of my own experience. I did my undergrad at Fort Lewis in Durango, Colorado, which kind of similar makeup in terms of landscape and even like the town's makeup and values. But what's different from that school is that they give free tuition to Native students. That was a huge bonus to me. And wherein your demographics for Native students are a little low, we'll look at that in a second, 40% of the student body at Fort Lewis College is Native, which is pretty huge. But even despite that, when I was matriculating back in the early 2000s, our curriculum very rarely, at least in the curriculums of like English studies or newspaper, which is the stuff I was studying, or like statistics, right? None of those featured Indigenous thought, which led me to believe probably we didn't have those kinds of Indigenous thinkers that could be part of my educational experience, which is a big fat lie. Studies show rates of enrollment and retention increase among students who feel represented by school curriculum, policies that are in place, even the faculty that's teaching. This is what we call inclusion, which is a huge difference from tokenism. Tokenism is a week to celebrate heritage, right? Inclusion is the full year and having curriculum imbued with a variety of thoughts and people. Having no representation at all is detrimental. Because, as an example, and this happens to a lot of marginalized communities, wherein a topic is being presented, and in this case, history class, right? Indian War of 1812. And then the professor looks to the one Native student and says, "What did you think about it, right? Or tell us your thoughts and what your people did." And that student is like, "First of all, that's not even my tribe. Second of all, I have no idea. I didn't study this." You're putting them on the spot in a way that makes the stress and anxiety of that situation might turn them off to that area of study later on. I see this even in the school system I work for. We do a lot to have inclusive, not just language, but also cultural elements within each of the areas of study. That has led to significant increase in outcomes for our K-12 kiddos. It's hard, super hard work, especially when you talk about a lot of our teachers are not representing the tribe that these students come from. But just having the content available has made significant strides for these students. And guess what? It didn't cost us a dime because our school legislature, or our legislature in the state allows us to incorporate and infuse some of those studies. We have to get around it because ethnic studies is the bad guy in Arizona, but because it's a tribal school system, we can work around that through sovereignty. So, an easy way to do this and implement these good relations with your Indigenous students and faculty is to start by building a land acknowledgement. And there are a lot of conversations happening right now, especially within Indian country, that land acknowledgements are kind of crappy. They really don't do a whole lot. Not a lot of teeth. A typical land acknowledgement is, yes, there were Indigenous people back then and possibly now, and we recognize them, right? And then they go on and they do their thing. I think that's a good start. I don't want to be like, that's terrible, because it's better than nothing. In a lot of these situations, most folks who are in the audience are like, "Oh yeah, I didn't realize that we had Native people here before." And you're like, "You're on Indian land. How did you not know that?" So those sort of like put the issue front and center sometimes, which is great. But they don't do enough in terms of like, well, how do we hold someone who's giving a land acknowledgement accountable to the people that they're talking about? So land acknowledgements, at least the good ones, are full of three factors, and we're going to talk about them and how you can incorporate that into this institution. So the first thing is Native visibility, both past and present. There are, Paiute, Goshu, Ute, Shoshone, Dene, folks that are of the past of Utah, but also of the contemporary landscape as well. So that's the first thing. Then you want to recognize the displacement that occurred, both to the land and those peoples, and the trauma that it currently imparts to those folks now. So when you talk about higher education institutions, the land that you're on, and I'm gonna give you a link to a fantastic article about how like 99% of the university system within the United States comes from land grab claims, which meant the displacement of indigenous people to create these institutions. Utah and Arizona, pretty much the whole system, the university system is based on these land grabs, which is violence against indigenous people. And then the third thing that land acknowledgements should have, and this is the big piece, is the decolonial work that you're gonna do to keep your organization accountable. So the first thing I would suggest for this institution is to look at your Native student body and see how you might increase that, right? And again, we go back to representation. And representation is oftentimes starts with just the numbers. This is from your own website, and it looks like it's up to date to the semester here, or the quarter here, which is great. You've got about a 1% Native student body showing up here. So of the 12,500 plus students that are matriculating, about 134 of them say or identify as Native. So which is great, because that means you can only go up from there. There's a lot of room to grow, and you want to grow, right? Having inclusive environments means not just better outcomes, but for Native students, but for everybody. Teachers teach better when they know they have a broader audience to give those lessons to. Students learn better when they realize it's not just their perceptions being taught, but the others around them, right? That's just humanity at work. Interesting enough, there are more white students than there are total Black, Indigenous people of color coming here. So again, lots of room to grow, and that could be part of your land acknowledgement, right? We will put into place practices that increase Native and Black, Indigenous people of color representation at our school. A great way to do this is to go into Indigenous communities and recruit. This always seems to surprise recruitment officers, because they're like, what? I didn't know that could happen. And I don't want to laugh at it, because I know that might be happening. Recruiters will go to a community and high school football game, for instance, and be like, oh, that's a great quarterback. We want him in our team. We're going to pitch our school to them and hope that they enroll. That doesn't happen in Indigenous communities unless it's a tribal school, or a school that's sort of adjacent to a reservation, and it's sort of like a box checking thing where they're like, well, we come here every May and we're hoping that some of your students might think about us, and here's our postcard, and call us if you need anything. And again, that goes back to Iktomi's story of communication, right? That cross-cultural communication that's so important, and understanding that Indigenous communities, right, we need those relationships to be built. It's not just a one and done kind of, we're here, we gave you our postcard and you didn't show up, right? We need you to do a little bit more work, because what are you giving us, right? We can look at your website and see that, what's really in it for us. So a big piece of that is, again, relationship building. So land acknowledgement for you guys might include increasing your Native student enrollment. It might also include faculty, right? Hiring faculty that represent various demographics, specifically Indigenous faculty. A big way to do this, and what other institutions have successfully done, is put a diverse student hiring committee together, so that they also have a say in who's being represented on the faculty. I think this is great. Of course, we talked about curriculum already. The students I was talking to earlier this week said that some of the classes do a good job, and several of them are like, yeah, my history class, we do a lot of great discussions on Indigenous people, and we have panels, and it's great. And I was like, wow, history class, what else? And it was like, that's pretty much it. History is a great place to start, but as I mentioned before, Indigenous thinkers and doers are part of every major area of study, I promise you. You can just look at, say, the Mars rover has several indigenous scientists attached to it, creating innumerable I don't speak science, so things that are on that rover, they're coming up with that, they're creating it. Again, it's beyond my pay grade, so I don't know what it is, but things that are important to that Mars mission, and they're there and they're happening. I was telling a story last night to some of your faculty of Blackfoot scientist. He's a NASA scientist, and he is utilizing his elders in his Blackfoot Nation, specifically his mother, and they created a NASA dictionary, Blackfoot NASA dictionary, so that they can translate words like black hole or asteroid into Blackfoot. And it's really super interesting how these elders are able to use, again, these traditional languages and come up with the concepts, right? So like black hole is sort of this curtain of possibilities is what it translates into. And I think that's just so beautiful. Another thing, again, incorporating indigenous thought into your curriculum. And an easy way to start this is to sort of seek out those thinkers. Natives Told You So on Twitter is a fantastic hashtag to follow because it looks at daily discoveries in journals and like studies that are like, oh, we discovered this really cool thing. And the hashtag Natives Told You So is sort of debunks that it's discovered, right? We know that's a problematic term just in general. So if you follow this thread, it's fantastic. There was a study that came out that was like, scientists discover that human DNA has the star particles in it. And Lakota origin stories, our history, will tell you that. We tell you that we come from the stars. And that might not mean, space, aliens, because we can't build pyramids without aliens. But I think the importance of that is, we could tell you that, right? And we used, astronavigation to sail the seas far before any Viking ever did. And I think that's pretty cool. So I'm going to wrap up here. And one of the things that positions your institution into a favorable land acknowledgement, because land acknowledgements, if they do anything, it's about land back, and land being that relative for Indigenous folks to reclaim, and also land that reclaims them too. And we talked about university systems, higher education, being the benefactors of land grabs or like the displacement of Indigenous people, right? Very likely that this whole town has ancestors of Paiutes and Utes and Goshutes and Dene and Shoshone underneath it. That's a lot of history, and that's a lot of contemporary trauma still that's not being addressed. And so using your position as what I Googled was the University of Parks, right? And your partnerships with National Park Service, that's a great starting point to really working with, Federal Bureau of Land Management in putting back into the hands of Native people these lands. This has been done successfully in other states. California just did this, and it starts with stewardship, of course, but literally this land goes back to Native people to care for. And as we've seen with some of these fires that are raging across, that have raged across our nation, Indigenous land practices could have prevented that. Again, hashtag Natives Told You So. So these things might sound hard, and they should. Remember, Trickster Medicine, it doesn't go down gently. You have to gag a few times and your eyes water a bit, I'm sure, because you often don't know what's good for you. But you can disrupt the status quo. Land acknowledgements can help you do that. And once you've met your goals through your land acknowledgement, the work isn't done, right? That's your starting point, right? We have a bigger student native body, bigger native student body. And now we're gonna work to increase the curriculum representation or increase faculty representation. Your work continues, and the land acknowledgement starts that work off. So I know we talked about a lot, and there's no time for questions, but I will be around campus all day today and tomorrow as well, and this is how you contact me for whatever. I'm totally happy to have you reach out, hit my DMs, and ask your questions, because I know there's a lot of stuff I didn't get to, and I know there's a lot of stuff you might want to ask that has nothing to do with my book or Tricksters. That's totally cool. Remember, we are a multitude of stories. So thank you for your time. Wopi the Tanka.